Connected. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are joining us today. Welcome to today's WFRN workshop, using freely downloadable new data to advance work-family research in 193 countries. I'm Jen Hook, WFRN's Vice President, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this virtual conference event series on behalf of WFRN's leadership team, our President Ellen Galinsky, Executive Director Steve Sweet. I also want to recognize the sponsorship of the Population Research Institute at Penn State University. Before introducing our speaker, I want to acknowledge that by joining us today, you're consenting to recording. The recording will be posted on WFRN's website for those who can't join us in person today. I also want to acknowledge that events are made possible by the very generous support of our members. If you're not a member yet, I encourage you to check out our website to learn more about WFRN and the benefits of membership. We'll pop a link into the chat. And please save the date for our in-person conference coming up June 20th to 22nd of next year in Montreal on the theme Big Questions in Work and Family. Submissions will open in July. And look for our next VCS event coming up in September. So I'm so pleased to introduce you to today's speaker. Amy Raub is Principal Research Analyst at the World Policy Analysis Center at UCLA. The World Center is the largest independent global policy data center with an international, multilingual, multidisciplinary team. The world collects and analyzes information on 2,500 social, economic, health, and environmental quantitative legal indicators for all 193 UN countries. Amy is an economist with 2 decades of experience working on discrimination and inequality. Her work focuses on the development of quantitative measures of laws and policies and how these measures can be used to advance monitoring, accountability, and evidence-based change. She's co-authored 2 books, more than 40 journal articles, and shared data and findings with the UN Human Rights Committees, civil society and intergovernmental organizations, and researchers around the world. Amy, with her colleagues Jody Hyman and Alita Sprague, have recently released a new book, Equality Within Our Lifetimes, How Laws and Policies Can Close or Widen Gender Gaps in Economies Worldwide. In just a moment, I'll drop the link in the chat, and the book is open access. The book is a systematic analysis of where the world stands, how far we've come, and how far we have to go when it comes to adopting laws and policies that are critical to advancing gender equality in the economy. It spans topics including girls' education, workplace discrimination and sexual harassment, and caregiving needs throughout the life course. And I am very much looking forward to hearing more about it and all the data that undergirds it. This is going to be run as a workshop, so please use the raise hand function and we'll make sure you can get unmuted and ask your questions and interact with Amy as much as you want to. So with that, welcome everyone, and over to you, Amy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you to the WFRN network for organizing this, and especially to Jen and Steve for everything you've done to make today possible. And of course, thank you for being here listening today. So to dive in, just to give you some a sense of what we'll be walking through today, since it is a longer session, I'll give you a little bit of a background on World and our methodology, and then a sense of the range of data areas covered, and then walk you through 4 different kind of data use cases of how you could use the data in your own research before I talk about kind of the range of ways that we can collaborate, because we are very open and very eager for collaborations. We really do hope and want this data to be used as a resource to advance research and moving from evidence to action. And throughout, please use the raise hand function, and I'll also try and stop and give opportunities for questions as well. So just as some background on World, for those of you who may not be familiar with our work, World really starts, our basis is in work family research, and started more than 2 decades ago, from the sense that there really wasn't comparable evidence out there to understand the approaches countries were taking to addressing what was happening for work-family policies. And this made it impossible to really systematically hold countries accountable to what they were doing on work-family issues, and also advance monitoring and accountability. And these pictures weren't taken 20 years ago. These pictures were actually only taken 10 years ago at when we went to visit the Convention on the Rights of the Child, a fundamental convention for monitoring children's rights. And of course, children's rights really deeply intersect with work-family research. So there's really these deep intersections between work-family policies and children's rights. And the monitoring for this happens on paper. So if you want to know what countries are doing, you couldn't just rapidly go anywhere to find out. There was no source of data to be able to analyze these policies quickly. And this really made it impossible to track progress, to run analyses, to find out how policies really move outcomes. So World's quantitative approach is really built around the idea of taking these really lengthy legislative documents. So 20,000 hours of work reading legislation across 193 countries. These are long documents. These are complicated documents, turning them into either a report that might take you 20 minutes to read, or data visualizations where you can really distill key findings in 20 seconds that provide policymakers, civil society, others who might move from evidence to action, something they can rapidly understand in 20 seconds. And we think having this policy data alongside implementation data, alongside outcomes data, is really key to being able to advance monitoring and accountability, to being able to run rigorous analyses that let us understand how policies are really moving outcomes, what's working under what conditions and when, so that we can really accelerate change at scale. Just to give you a sense of the range of our data areas, we've grown a lot over the years. We started first with adult labor and working conditions. It was originally called the Work-Family Equity Index, focused on core areas of paid leave, annual leave. And over the years, we've added things like equal rights and discrimination, non-discrimination at work, child labor, child marriage. So we really cover a wide range of things that matter to human development, well-being, and equity. Our coding process is lengthy. All of the data that you see on our website, all of the data that we've made public use, is based on original legislative text. So constitutional rights, legislation, or policy documents. To do that, we rely on a coding team with advanced skills. They're multilingual, English, French, Spanish, other language skills. They're reading legislation in its original language whenever possible, or in an official translation. They're multidisciplinary, and they're answering questions using a common code book that we've developed with input from civil society, that we've tested on a subset of countries, that also evolves over time as we test and go back and realize that maybe we didn't capture an important approach that countries are taking. We meet regularly as a coding team to adjust this framework. They're double coding these and then reconciling it. At the end, we're going back and doing database cleaning, verification of outliers, and periodic updates. So we do rely on coding from original legislation. So this sets us apart from other data initiatives that often rely on surveys from in-country. We think this is important because it ensures a consistent approach across countries. Countries often take very different approaches in legislation. We're applying the same exact framework to every single country. We're ensuring that framework is applied consistently. We are running as many verification checks as we can to minimize human error. And of course, we are always very open to checks and further checks as we go along, and if anyone sees an error, very open to being pointed to legislation we may have missed or other issues. A few principles underlie our coding framework. We really want this to be actionable data. So our focus is not just on capturing yes, no, does a policy exist? That's not actionable. That doesn't provide policymakers with enough information to be able to design a policy. They need to be able to know key features of the policy. They also need to know about implementation and enforcement measures that really matter to making sure a policy is going to work effectively once it's put in place. We also capture legal text while we're building our databases. This has two purposes. It makes it easier for us to clean the database, to build it, to ensure it's done consistently, but it also enables us to share policy data with policymakers, with civil society, so that they have a sense of the legal approaches that are being taken. We also know that policy design decisions matter to individuals. So things that may seem like small details can have tremendous impacts on who's eligible for a policy, whether they can afford to take leave, whether there are legal loopholes that leave people out. So we spend a lot of time capturing those details and ensuring that those are captured consistently, because those details are where policy implementation is actually undermined. So now we come to the book that we've recently launched. Equality Within Our Lifetimes really pulls together the full range of all of our data on gender and in the economy specifically. And this really came out of a realization that we'd started capturing policies from across a lot of different spheres that matter to gender in the economy. And we noticed that on the outcome side, there'd been a real stalling on progress towards closing gender gaps. And there seemed to be almost this assumption that countries had done gender policies and there wasn't much more to do. But when you looked at the legal data, there were actually really large gaps that weren't necessarily being talked about. And the data really made those transparent. So what we wanted to use the book to do was to show where these remaining policy gaps were really continuing to undermine gender equality in the economy. And we also thought we had the data over time to really show how change has also been possible and feasible. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the data side. Since this is a research audience, I encourage you to take a look at the book. As Jen said, it's freely downloadable, it's open access. The book pulls together a lot on research evidence, on case studies. There's a lot more in there than what I'm sharing today. So I do encourage you to take a look. So key policy areas that you can download now from our website and are free to use in your work. First one is paid parental leave. This is our oldest data area, and many of you are probably familiar with at least the most basic data we have available on this because it's been shared a lot in the media. and probably over the years as well through the WFRN network. This map in particular gets a lot of traction on global media, and we love to use mapping because it's a really powerful way to convey data really quickly. As you can see, just glancing at this map, nearly every country in the world has paid leave for mothers of infants. The only countries that don't are those in red: the United States, Papua New Guinea, and a few small South Pacific island states. This map has been picked up by media outlets around the world and used by policymakers as well. Suriname being the most recent country to pass paid leave for mothers of infants, and in passing it, their legislature did note their status as a global outlier on paid leave. And we use colors in our map as well to show kind of value judgments. We're aware of the value judgment that colors provide in mapping. So the green in here, light green, is tied to the ILO recommendation of at least 14 weeks of paid maternity leave. Dark green to the WHO, 26 weeks to facilitate exclusive breastfeeding. When it comes to paid leave for men, we of course know that men's leave matters immensely to to gender equality too. Engaging men in caregiving from the start can set those norms for caregiving throughout the life course. But of course, men have far less access to paid leave than women on a global scale. And mapping is a way that really quickly conveys this. And when we look at whether there are actually incentives and whether leave is structured in a way that encourages men to take paid leave, this map looking at whether the leave is really reserved for men or whether it's only available as a shared entitlement, which research evidence shows that men are much likely to take leave when it's shared versus when it's reserved or there are incentives. We can see that, far fewer countries are really structuring leave in a way that fathers are likely to take a meaningful amount of leave. We also have longitudinal data available, and this is something that is an increasing part of our data. In some areas, it's something we've intentionally built. So for paid parental leave, as part of a project, we took select data sets back to 1995, back to the Beijing Platform for Action, which included a lot of key gender equality commitments. And here you can see paid leave for fathers in particular has really markedly increased since 1995. I would say in particular, and we've got data that will be forthcoming over the next year or so, over the past decade, we're really seeing an uptick in leave that's really explicitly reserved for fathers, really those incentives for fathers to take leave as well. So the longitudinal data is becoming more and more available, both intentionally and as we just continue to build data over time. So we create longitudinal data out of data we've just been collecting for a long time. And this helps to enable more types of analysis, but it also helps to enable monitoring and accountability for holding countries accountable to whether they're really changing these laws and policies. One of the pieces we're also increasingly interested in, and this is part of a newer part of our data area and part of the most recent data launch, is guarantees to workers who have historically been excluded or in more vulnerable employment. So this is whether countries guarantee paid leave, paid maternal leave to self-employed workers. This is really a first step to trying to reach workers in the informal economy as well in many settings. So As you can see, countries in yellow have paid leave, but they don't have any mechanism that could reach self-employed workers. So that's a huge gap, particularly in Africa, where so many women work in the informal economy. There are some important approaches there, but also some very large gaps. We've also done this for domestic workers, agricultural workers, part-time workers, really trying to understand coverage for different groups of workers. And we'll have more detailed data on this coming out probably over the next year. Another piece of ongoing research is trying to understand how leave reaches, another piece is gender equality in leave. So one natural question is, well, there might not be gender equality in birth leave because there is a physical reason why you would want women to have more leave when they're giving birth. They need time. There may be complications before birth. During pregnancy, they need time for their own health, after birth to recover from birth, to establish breastfeeding. But in the case of adoption, there's no biological reason for men and women to be treated any differently. But as you can see in this map, every country in orange or yellow actually treats men and women differently in law when they're adopting for paid parental leave. So this is a case of gender inequality that's embedded in law and quite hidden. You wouldn't necessarily see it without comparable data to make it really readily available. This is also an area we're looking at adoption, single parent families, other forms of family where we're trying to just understand the equity aspects of how leave is available for different family types, since historically in many countries, leave has been built around the assumption of kind of a man and a woman as the parents. And we're seeing shifts in those policies over time in some countries, but in others, there is that embedded assumption. So this just gives a summary of the data that we have available now online for infant caregiving, as well as some of the data that we'll have coming out over probably the coming year or so. As I'm sure is the case with many research institutions, time and funding is always the barrier to getting more data online. So often there is much more data on the back end in our data sets than can make it online, just due to the time involved with trying to clean indicators and make sure they're fully ready to get online. But we do have a massive amount of data available on our website. So another aspect for work family researchers where we have a large amount of data online right now is paid leave for children's health, children's needs. So while the world has nearly universal agreement on paid leave for infant caregiving, there's far less for paid leave for children's health needs. And this is looking at any leave for children's serious health needs. This is something that fortunately not every family will have to go through, but for very serious health needs, it's also something that can derail a parent's career. And quite often it's the mother's career that is impacted the most. And as you can see, there are significant gaps in the availability of leave. And those gaps get even larger when you think about whether the amount of paid leave available is really sufficient to meet a serious health need. Those countries in dark green are the only ones that guarantee at least 26 weeks or more when you're thinking about a serious illness like cancer, which some research studies put as requiring perhaps a year away from work during the first year following diagnosis. There are very few countries globally that really have sufficient leave available for parents to meet that level of caregiving. And we, of course, know parental presence, that income security matters to children's health and recovery. And of course, the income security is important during this time. We also break down this data by the age of the child, because one thing we noticed as we were building this data is some countries limit leave availability by child's age. They'll have more leave available for younger children than for older children, which might make sense for routine illnesses. You might expect that, a parent doesn't need to stay home with a 15-year-old who has a cold in the same way they need to stay home when their 3-year-old has a cold, but perhaps isn't as reasonable when you're thinking about serious illnesses where you would still expect that you would want to have a parent there to accompany their child. And here we're looking at everyday illnesses, which has even less paid leave availability than serious illnesses. I think this came up very much in the context of the pandemic. Parents are supposed to keep their children home when they're sick. We learned this during the pandemic. It matters during every year, though. It matters for stopping gastrointestinal disease, for stopping the spread of influenza. But there's very little support in policy for parents to be able to do this. And of course, when that support is there, again, it tends to be on the shorter side. So it may not be sufficient, particularly when you think about those early years when children are first making that transition from a home setting to a childcare or school setting, and they're likely to be very frequently ill. And we also look separately at health needs for children with disabilities as well, because of course these can have very profound impacts on parental employment. And we have a whole series of data devoted to the specific needs of children with disabilities. And then one separate piece we also looked at was just paid leave policies that were introduced or expanded to meet the increased childcare needs during the pandemic itself. This focused on those first 6 months of the pandemic, when really there were pretty universal school or childcare closures. And what we saw was that there were pretty big gaps in whether there was any policy support for working parents during that time to support childcare needs. This just looks at whether there was any policy introduced at all. We do have a whole series of data here looking at the duration, the wage replacement rate, and other factors related to the adequacy of that paid leave if you're interested in it. And then here again, this is a summary of the data we have available online on children's needs, as well as the data forthcoming for children's needs. So increasingly, the world is grappling with how we address aging as well, and elder care is becoming a larger global issue in low income as well as high income countries. But globally, provisions for caring for adult family members receives even less attention than provisions enabling care for children. And again, these provisions are often too short to support care for more serious health needs, especially when you think about end-of-life care, which may be lengthier. We have this data available looking at a whole series of relationships, understanding that the length of leave needed to care may also depend very much on how many people are available to care. So we've done this for aging parents, for spouses. We've looked at this as well. Some countries limit to whether you're living within the same household or whether you're living it outside the household. So we've broken this data down in many ways, and there's a whole series of data available online to download on this as well. So maybe I'll pause right now and just before I go into laws prohibiting discrimination at work and what we have around caregiving, and just see if there are any questions on either the paid leave data or just our methodology in general.
Go ahead and ask a question, Amy. This is very sort of technical on paid parental leave around wage replacement. I'm just wondering if, I know you have so many indicators off the top of your head, what you do with wage replacement where the percentage seems to be pretty high, but there's a cap in the policy, which then in effect makes it not so high.
Yeah, so right now for the global data, we haven't been looking at that. So the global data reports the minimum and maximum wage replacement rates, and we look at whether that's a flat rate, because there are a few countries like Australia or the UK that just pay a flat rate. So we do capture those. We do have some earlier published papers that did get into those caps, primarily around the OECD, and looked at those relative to affordability, because and looked at those with regards to minimum wage levels and with regards to average wage levels to try to understand whether workers could really afford to take leave. The reason we don't do that at the global level is just because it's so hard to get globally comparative data on average wages or minimum wages. So that would be a separate undertaking on its own. So in the databases themselves, we capture those levels. So it would be possible to go and do that, but we haven't made that data public because it's a separate undertaking to then map it to that kind of affordability analysis. And the cap doesn't have meaning without tying it to that level. So I think that's a good example of a research project that would be really interesting to do globally, because it does have massive implications for what those wage replacement rates really mean. But to do it across all 193 countries is a larger challenge.
Great, thank you.
All right, if there's no other questions right now, I'll keep going and assume that everyone's just curious to see more data and then what they can do with it. Okay. So laws prohibiting discrimination at work. So as I mentioned, when we were starting on the book, one of the things that first came out, one of the things we were first interested in were these gender gaps and how much was really a care gap, thinking about those ILO figures of how 606 million women prior to the pandemic were out of the workforce due to unpaid care reasons compared to only 40 million men. And when you look at prohibitions of discrimination at work, nearly all of the world prohibits gender discrimination, 93% of countries. But when you start looking at care, it drops off rapidly. So 69% of countries prohibit pregnancy discrimination, 58% do it for marital status or women's marital status. So these are really prohibitions about the expectation that women will be getting pregnant in the near future. And then even fewer do it based on parenting status. And here you could even break this out further because some of these are family responsibilities. And going back to the elder care question we just touched on, some countries are only prohibiting discrimination for parents. They're not protecting people with other forms of caregiving discrimination. And of course, that's going to be a continuing issue as the global population continues to age. So, and just to note that, again, each of these, what's underlying it is that global data that you could map, you could merge onto other data sets that gives you the country by country level data. I've just turned this into a graph so that you can really compare across the statuses. And that's what having the quantitative data enables you to do, is to be able to look across these groups as well. And I think another interesting thing about this data is it answers some questions that can otherwise be hidden. So when we look at gender discrimination provisions themselves, the real gaps in women's employment outcomes are about advancement to leadership positions. And when you look at laws prohibiting gender discrimination at work, the real gaps in the legal provisions are also in the laws that matter most to advancement. They're about ensuring equal training opportunities. They're about ensuring equal opportunities to advance. Almost every country says that women should have equal pay. Many of these are the stronger equal pay for work of equal value. Hiring and terminations are very common, but fewer are ensuring these training. And similarly, if I go back to pregnancy, most of these pregnancy provisions are about terminations. They're about saying a woman can't be fired when she's pregnant. They're not about saying that you still have to hire pregnant women, you still have to advance pregnant women, you still have to give people opportunities to advance their career while they're pregnant. And I think that's something that's important to be aware of and important to think of and comes out of the data. Coming back to the intersectionality question, the data also lets us start to look at and think about multiple sources of discrimination. This is a little hard to read, but this is looking at whether countries are prohibiting both gender and based on other characteristics. So religion and gender, race and gender, disability and gender are all very well covered. Disability is actually really exciting because disability is one that's really grown in the past few years. The massive growth in protections, thanks largely to very strong civil society movements, the CRPD, et cetera. Age and gender, social class and gender, foreign national origin, migration, much less covered, and then very low coverage for sexual orientation and gender identity globally. You know, why does this matter? Age and gender, when you think about older women, especially older women facing caregiving responsibilities, that's another source of discrimination that's not nearly as well covered. Also, older women having a longer lifespan than men, working longer, but not having adequate protections from discrimination. Social class, foreign national origin, migration status, all likely to be intertwined with racial and ethnic discrimination, all not nearly as well covered as racial and ethnic discrimination. So maybe a way where racial and ethnic discrimination comes in as another name and isn't protected. And this is just an example of how we've been able to show change over time through just database updates by having data at multiple points in time. We'll soon have 2023 data, so we'll be able to show more change over time. So this is actually with this data, we're actually able to essentially track progress since the start of the Sustainable Development Goals, which includes a very strong protection for equal opportunities at work, which is great. And so we have a lot of data online around laws prohibiting discrimination at work for all of the aspects of work: hiring, pay, training, promotions and demotions and terminations. Across the 14 characteristics, we have separate data points. We have indirect discrimination. We have implementation and enforcement data around employer responsibility to prevent discrimination, prohibitions of retaliation, and more pieces on monitoring bodies. And I'm not getting into, since this is more of a work family audience, all of the data we have on sexual harassment. But if there is interest and time at the end, I'm happy to go into some of that data. So unless there are any hands, I'll just dive into kind of examples of how the data can be used. Okay, great. So one of the easiest ways, and I hope this has come across a bit through the mapping and the graphs and different pieces, one of the most straightforward ways the data can be used is through monitoring and accountability. This is a descriptive data set, so it can be used just to quickly describe where the world stands in particular areas and map that to specific commitments, specific things you care about. So one of the papers we worked on was around caregiving responsibilities. And of course, much of the gender wage gap in many countries is really a motherhood gap. So one of the things we were a bit surprised to see was that there were a not insignificant number of countries globally that prohibited caregiving discrimination against mothers, but not fathers. And we thought that mattered because as long as you're saying that only women should be protected from caregiving discrimination, you're also saying only women can be caregivers. So you're kind of reinforcing those outdated gender norms that men are breadwinners and women are caregivers. So in this paper, we mapped for the different caregiving statuses you saw before, just how many protected mothers, how many protected fathers, and then looked at those kind of differences and how many countries were only protecting mothers, how many countries were sending that signal that only women were caregivers, and really tried to make that transparent and obvious. Another way is monitoring progress over time. So this graph looks at that older ILO recommendation of ensuring that women have at least 14 weeks of paid maternity leave. We look at change over time since the Beijing Platform for Action in 1995, looking at the share of countries that guarantee at least 14 weeks of paid leave to both mothers and fathers. Why look at fathers? Again, it's that idea that paid leave should be equally available to men and women to close that gender gap in care. So these types of mappings you can also do, which we've done to conventions where there's agreement that policies matter to health, policies matter to employment outcomes. anywhere that there's some kind of agreement that policies matter, the data can be used to rapidly look at where there are still gaps in meeting these fundamental, taking that first step. Of course, having a law on the books doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to be great, that it's going to be fully implemented, that the policy will reach everyone, but it is an important first step towards moving towards better implementation. So use case number 2. We've done a series of papers looking at structural inequalities, and since World is based in the US, we've done this first looking at US national legislation. We'll have research coming out probably over the next year or so, doing this for subnational legislation as well. The US, of course, does not have paid family medical leave at the national level. It does have unpaid family medical leave. It also has eligibility requirements embedded in the national legislation that exclude many workers. So the graph that you can see here pulls in the different eligibility requirements that exclude workers at small firms, that exclude part-time workers, that exclude people who recently changed jobs. And it also looks at whether families are likely to be able to afford to take paid leave. And it looks across at, based on that, who wouldn't have access to paid leave. And as you can see, estimated access is very low, or exclusions are very high once you do that. And exclusions vary across age, and they vary across race as well. And we can also break that down. So all of these analyses were conducted using the CPS data, which gives us data on worker characteristics. It gives us data on how many hours they've worked, how big their employer is, how long they've worked there, et cetera, and basic demographics. So here we're calculating just based on the number of hours you're required to work to be eligible for unpaid FMLA, how many workers are likely to be excluded. So the part-time work requirement excludes women more than men. That's not very surprising that women are more likely to be in part-time work than men. And we can merge that back onto the global data. So what does the global data help us with? The global data tells us that this type of exclusion that I think many people in the US just assume you have to have. They kind of assume that, you know, we have to exclude part-time workers. You know, 96% of high-income countries are covering part-time workers, and 93% of all countries are covering part-time workers. So by putting the global together with the local, you can kind of just help to dispel those ideas that that doing something differently isn't feasible. And in fact, if you we've been doing a project based on the subnational data in the US, using state and city policies to look at paid family medical leave and paid sick and safe days, and you don't see these same types of requirements nearly as often at the state level either. So it's really just the federal level that has these. We took a similar approach looking at firm size. So firm size requirements that exclude people working at businesses with 50 or fewer than 50 employees. That primarily excludes Latinx workers. And those just aren't done at the global level. And I think that was actually a really surprising finding to us. We ended up checking and rechecking the data because we expected some country to have some type of broad exclusion for small employers, and they just weren't there. The only ones we found were these really, narrow exclusions for family workers when they're less than 5, or agricultural when they're less than 10. But there was a rational reason for that, just because of how costs were shared, how social insurance systems are set up. It makes sense that these exclusions don't happen. A third type of data use case is really initial hypothesis testing. So all of the data you've seen in the maps and graphs today is freely available on the website. It's downloadable. These are all national level policy indicators. So you can really rapidly go and download these, merge it on to World Bank data, World Development Indicators, UNESCO data on education, any other source of data that gives you outcomes you want to measure, or other covariates you want to really look at the associations between policies and outcomes and do some initial hypothesis testing. And that's what we did for one of the earliest studies I worked on after I joined World. And this was around paid maternity leave. So there have been research to date showing that in high-income countries, paid maternity leave reduced infant mortality. But no one knew whether it would really work in low-income countries. And there were a lot of reasons why people thought it might not, that these policies might not really matter in low-income settings. A lot of women work in the informal economy. Are benefits actually reaching women? So one of the first studies was just taking World Bank data on, or WHO data on infant mortality, controlling for things like per capita GDP, total health expenditures, female literacy, access to improved water and skilled birth attendance, and running a really basic regression, looking at all countries versus OECD, non-OECD countries, so lower income countries. And that study showed that, yes, there is an association between weeks of paid maternal leave and reduced infant mortality. Could we say definitively that paid maternal leave was reducing infant mortality? No, this was just a really simple regression trying to look at the association between variables. But it was a first study trying to understand that relationship. And that's something that's really readily available with the data that's available online, with the data that's increasingly being collected, especially as there's more and more push for monitoring around the SDGs, around SDG 5 in particular, with measuring gender. So these are kind of the types of preliminary studies that I think are low-hanging fruit for kind of these initial hypothesis testing of whether policies are working across a range of studies, or whether something might be there for policies and outcomes. And then the last data use case is the next step, to do that more rigorously. And that's a much larger investment of time and a larger investment of energy, but I think it's a really exciting phase of research, and one that we're really deeply invested in and care about. So there's a whole range of surveys that have been conducted across low and middle income countries. And I'm going to focus on low and middle income countries just because there's been far less rigorous research done in low and middle income countries than in high income countries. Could you use these same approaches across high income countries? Yes, certainly. But the biggest research gap right now is in these lower income settings. So demographic and health surveys, they've been conducted across more than 100 low and middle income countries. They've been conducted over time. They've been conducted relatively consistently across countries and over time. So you can compare both across countries and over time, individual outcomes on these very large global populations. And the data, harmonized data, is available for download through IPUMS. We've also internally kind of supplemented that harmonization as we've needed on our research team. We've worked with partners who have done the same. Mixed harmonized data is supposed to be coming out through IPUMS hopefully later this year. I'm not sure. And so these allow for looking at things like maternal mortality outcomes, family planning, reproductive health, material deprivation and living standards, educational outcomes, nutrition, child health, just the really, as well as interpersonal violence, decision-making in the household, just a really wide range of things that we, I think, would hope as work family researchers that these policies would be able to move, and also that policymakers would really care about, because when we talk about policies, when we talk about building the investment case for these policies, being able to talk about the impact that spans multiple outcomes is often important. These data sets also allow us to control for things at the individual level. So we have individual data on mothers, individual data on children. We have data on the household. And then of course we can get country level data on GDP or spending to further control. So what that is really about is about taking advantage of natural experiments that happen across countries. So it's not ethical to randomize a policy experiment in the same way that people are able to randomize controlled trials. So I can't, just go and randomize the introduction of a new discrimination law and run an experiment nationwide. But running an RCT also isn't the same, because there are differences between how policies scale up, and what works at a national scale may be very different than what works at the programmatic RCT level. But these natural experiments, these policy variations that happen within countries, we can take advantage of that, because with the longitudinal data, we know where policy changes happen. We have these longitudinal surveys, so we can identify where we have countries before and after a policy change, and where we have policy changes, countries where policy change hasn't occurred. So building on that, collaborators built on that early maternal leave study that we did, and they looked at 20 countries. They looked at countries that had increased their paid maternity leave and countries that didn't. They used data on more than 200,000 live births, nearly 300,000. And they looked at the probability, whether that changed the probability of infant death across 20 countries. And they found that each additional month led to 7.9 fewer infant deaths per 1,000 live births, a 14% relative reduction. That's huge. So this provided the first really rigorous evidence, because they're controlling for differences across households, they're controlling for differences over time, they're controlling for differences across countries. They're using difference in difference techniques, quasi-experimental, to answer the question that yes, even in countries where there's these really high rates of informal employment, paid maternity leave does seem to have an impact. It is reducing infant death. And subsequent studies identify plausible pathways. We had there was one study looking at the probability of receiving the D2P vaccine. Encouragingly, the study found the impact where you would most expect it. The largest impacts were on the vaccines farthest after birth, where you would expect paid leave to have the biggest difference. They didn't find an impact on polio, which is often campaign-based, anytime, anywhere. Also found an impact on breastfeeding, another pathway for reducing infant mortality and reducing bloody diarrhea. So all of these studies were kind of confirming what that early hypothesis testing suggested might be the case, that paid maternity leave was having an impact even in these settings where more women were working in the informal economy. And just to give you a better sense of how this research is really done, so for the breastfeeding study, you see kind of the list of countries. How we can figure out which countries we're able to use is based on the survey years that are available. So we're looking at we're really constrained by when we're able to get the survey years. And then once we have the survey years, we then map it onto what the policy change looks like. So we're trying to find countries where we have a survey before the policy change and a survey after the policy change. So we can do those difference in difference techniques so that we have control and treatment in countries that experience policy changes, as well as control groups in countries that didn't experience policy changes. And then this is just an example of the types of models that are run. So a simple model that's not really controlling for many factors, a model that adds in controls at the household level, at the individual level, and then finally a model that adds in other country level controls. So really, trying to look at all of those different factors that might be driving those differences. So as I said at the beginning, our hope with sharing all of this data, all of the different ways you can use this data is really because we want the data to get used. There is way more analysis that can be done with this data than one research center could ever do on its own. So if you go to our website, it's worldpolicycenter.org. You can spell center whichever way you like, either ER or RE, whatever your preference is. If you go to the little button on the corner with the 3 lines and click it, go down to maps and data and expand it, there's a data download button that will take you to where you can download the data. If you ever have trouble downloading the data, I know sometimes people do, feel free to reach out to us. We're always happy to help people who have trouble downloading the data. Our most recently launched data is freely available for public use. We, of course, are very open to exploring other collaborations with research centers, particularly around advanced methods, quasi-experimental methods, and others to really advance the field of knowledge. You know, these more advanced studies, they are tremendously time intensive. They're incredibly important. I think they really contribute to the field of knowledge, and we've seen them just get a tremendous amount of uptake from policymakers and civil society. We know that they're really interested in having those very evidence-based studies. When lawmakers in the Philippines were looking to extend the duration of paid maternity leave, they cited our studies on infant mortality as one of the reasons why they should be extending it. So this is something policymakers are very eager for, but it is something that takes time. So we're very interested in working with other centers interested in doing this type of work. The legislative language, of course, we've also worked with people interested in going deeper on the qualitative side. As I mentioned before, all of our databases have the legal text underpinning it. So we capture a massive amount of text with our data, and it's just not feasible to put all of that data online because of the massive amount of time it would take to clean and put it online. We do it for a few select areas. I think we have it for some areas of our constitutional rights, some areas of child marriage, and some of our discrimination at work data, but it's pretty limited, and it's a real time investment. But if you are interested in legislative language and doing a deep dive into qualitative, we are certainly interested in exploring that as well. And then finally, there are so many more areas of law where I think quantitatively knowing, having quantitative indicators could make a real difference for monitoring and accountability and for research. It's a large time investment to build these data. Building it the first time is, of course, the largest time investment, and then it's updating and keeping it up to date. But there are many topics we would love to do, but just haven't had the time or funding to do. But we have worked with groups in the past to partner on areas to produce data in new areas. And we are certainly open to doing that again, to sharing knowledge of what we've learned over the years about building comparative policy data, and very much welcome conversations around that as well. So just popping up on the screen, my email address, as well as the email address for one of my colleagues, Nick Perry, who leads our knowledge mobilization efforts. Please do feel to reach out, and I'll open it up for any questions you may have now about anything I've covered today.
I just want to quickly pop in and say thank you, Amy. This is amazing, an amazing amount of information and resources. I've had some folks in the direct chat telling me about how they want to use this in teaching, and it just seems like an amazing generative resource that I'm so happy you've shared with us today. One question is, when we go to the data download and we click on the different data sets, what format are we going to find the data in?
Sure. So you'll get an email that I think gives you a link to download, and it comes in a zip file that I believe gives you a Stata file, an Excel file, and a Word document codebook. The codebook describes the value labels that correspond to the numeric codes, as well as whatever information we thought was helpful for explaining why we made the coding decisions that we did and categorized it like we did. Generally, our data downloads correspond to how you see the data mapped on the website. So it is that categorical data. That's because we've spent the most time cleaning the maps and formatting the data that way, because we use that for civil society, for policymakers, for others. If you are working on a research project where it's really important to have continuous or a different way we have on it, we do sometimes do different formats. So time is always a valuable resource, I think, for any research organization. So I can't make any guarantees, but of course do reach out.
Okay, great. Not to create extra work for you, but I did hear that it's a possibility if someone needed something more detailed for a research project that sort of exists behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Questions for Amy? Well, I'm going to jump in with one more question then. So obviously this is a gigantic undertaking that the center has been working on for quite a while. What are the primary funders of this work?
So we've been fortunate to have a range of funders over the years. So we've been based at both Harvard, McGill, and now UCLA over the years. So our funding has shifted as we've moved. When we were in Canada, most of our funding came from the Canadian government and different funding sources there. Since we've been at UCLA, we've been primarily foundation funding. Hewlett, Gates, and Hilton have been our largest funders lately, but also some like Blue Shield and others. So we've been incredibly grateful to the support they've provided over the years.
And I'll get in one more. So you are very deeply immersed in this data. So for anybody approaching it the first time, downloading it, do you have any sort of tips or tricks for a newbie working with this data?
So the data is set up, I think, pretty simply for Stata. I mean, it is all mostly categorical variables. So it's mostly just 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 for the values. And that's how we map it online. We try not to do more than, we try to keep it simple so that it's easy to understand. Our goal is that when people look at a map or when you're tabbing a variable, you have a sense really rapidly of whether a policy is strong or whether a policy is weak. So the 5s are generally a strong policy. The 1 is generally a policy isn't there at all, or it's very, very weak. That goes back to our understanding that when you look at those maps that do have that red to green color coding, that automatically gives a value judgment to people. And we include with all of our data sets, so it's helpful for people who are interested in looking at differences across region or across income, data on country region as defined by the World Bank, and country income group, again, as defined by the World Bank. So you can quickly tab those differences just using the tab command and comma column to just look to see, do our high income countries more likely to take this approach, or which region is the strongest. And I think for some policies there really are surprising regional or income group differences or lack of differences.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that really struck out to me when you were talking about restrictions on leave for part-time workers, which seems so normal to many of us in the United States. And then to see globally that we are once again extremely weird in the United States. Any questions for Amy before we wrap things up? Oh, we've got one popped in here about, do you include characteristics about each country's population in the data set?
No, we don't include any kind of demographic or population data in the data set. It is possible to merge the data onto other data sets that have those, like the World Bank's World Development Indicators or others. We include the ISO 2 codes as well as the ISO 3 codes for merging. Not all external data sets will have those codes, so you may have to do some cleaning of country names for merging because external data sets don't always, there's no real consistency across the UN system of how countries are named in their formatting, unfortunately. So that's something that if I ever had a dream wish list of data management, it would be that those codes were used more consistently across external data sets, but we don't include that. One thing too, I would just say, Jen, to your point about starting points, if it is an area of data you're less familiar with or policy that you're interested in learning more about, we do on our website have a section for fact sheets, and those give a nice kind of overview about policy and research. You know, they're usually 1 or 2 pages and just give kind of key findings. So those can be a nice kind of primer on policies if people are interested.
Great, thank you. Any last questions for Amy? You can unmute, you can pop yourself in the chat.
If no one has any questions, I'll just share screen so people can kind of see where resources are. And if anyone jumps in with a question, I'll stop sharing. So when you go to our website, you'll see all of these kind of buttons with different topics. If you click a topic, you can scroll down and view all of the categories. Sometimes it's a little slow loading because we have so much data on it right now. We're trying to figure out how to better balance the amount of data we have, but you can see all of these and you can click on any of these to look more closely at the data. And then here, as I was saying earlier, if you go here, you can download the data, and under resources and publications, you'll find our full list of journal articles that use the data, as well as the fact sheets I mentioned, which give a nice little overview. And for the book we were describing, there's a very long list of different fact sheets that accompany the book.
Well, if there are no further questions, please join me in thanking Amy for this really wonderful presentation. I know I have learned a lot, and I'm going to be spending a good amount of time on the World Policy Center's website over the next few days.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, thanks for joining us, everybody. Remember, next VCS event will be sometime in early September. Details will be coming soon, and call for submissions comes out in July for our in-person conference in Montreal next June. Thanks, everyone.